I've been sitting with this story for months, trying to figure out how to tell it without making myself look like the villain, though I'll admit, for a good stretch of that night, I absolutely was. My name is Priya. I'm 34 years old, a marketing manager at a mid-sized firm in Atlanta, and up until about 8 months ago, I thought I had a pretty solid read on my marriage, my friendships, and my own character. Turns out, one impulsive decision can unravel every assumption you've made about yourself. My husband, Kieran, is a good man. I want to say that clearly before anything else, because everything that follows could easily paint him as the problem, and he wasn't. He's quiet where I'm loud, cautious where I'm spontaneous, and he processes things inward the way I process them outward, by talking, by moving, by being in rooms full of people. We've always known this about each other. We've always managed it, until we didn't. The party in question was thrown by my colleague Tamzin, a woman who lives in a sprawling house in Buckhead and hosts these elaborate networking events that blur the line between professional and social in a way that makes some people deeply uncomfortable. Kieran was one of those people. He'd been to one of Tamzin's gatherings before, about 2 years ago, and had spent most of the evening standing near the food table looking like a man waiting for a bus that would never come. He didn't say anything harsh about it afterward, that's not his style. But he made it quietly, unmistakably clear that he had no desire to repeat the experience. So when I told him about this one, a summer rooftop party, about 60 people catered, I already knew the conversation we were going to have, and I had it. He was gentle but firm. He had a work deadline the following Monday. He was tired from a rough week, and honestly, he said, looking at me with that steady gaze of his, "Priya, I just don't want to go. I'm sorry." And I said fine. But I didn't feel fine. I felt something I'm not proud of, a low, simmering frustration that had been building for a while. Not just about this party, about the pattern, about how often I found myself going alone to things I wanted to share with him, and how I'd started to feel a creeping loneliness inside what was otherwise a loving marriage. I hadn't said any of that out loud. I should have. Instead, I picked up my phone and texted his best friend. His name is Awais. He and Kieran had been friends since university, the kind of friendship that's so old and deep it almost functions like family. Awais was funny, sociable, the kind of person who makes any room louder just by walking into it. He was also single, freshly out of a 2-year relationship, and I told myself that inviting him was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. A friend accompanying a friend to a party. Nothing unusual about that. I told myself that. I told myself that a lot. What I didn't fully examine, what I buried under the logic of it, was the fact that part of me wanted Kieran to know. Part of me wanted him to see the text notification pop up, wanted him to feel something. Not jealousy, exactly. More like, I wanted him to understand what it costs me to always be the one adjusting. I didn't tell him I'd invited Awais. I just said I was going with some people from work. Awais picked me up at 8. He looked good. Not in a way that meant anything romantic, but in the way of someone who had recently decided to take care of themselves again after a hard period. He'd gotten a haircut, was wearing a jacket that actually fit, and when I got into his car, he looked at me for a second and said, "Does Kieran know I'm the one driving you?" I mentioned I was going with people, I said. Awais was quiet for a moment. So that's a no. It's not a big deal, Awais. He didn't push it. He put on music and pulled out of the driveway, and I watched the lights of our neighborhood fall away behind us, and I told myself again that this was fine. The party was everything Tamzin's parties always were, beautifully arranged, slightly overwhelming, full of people who were performing a version of themselves they'd carefully curated for professional consumption. The rooftop was strung with Edison lights. There was a raw bar. A jazz quartet played in the corner at a volume carefully calibrated to allow conversation without drowning it. For the first hour, it was actually nice. Awais was easy company. He had a gift for making strangers feel like old friends, and he worked the room with me without making it weird, and I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks. I introduced him to colleagues as my husband's best friend, always, every time, because I knew the shape of rumors and I wasn't interested in one. But around the second hour, something shifted. I'd had 2 glasses of wine, which is one more than I usually have at work-adjacent events. Tamsin had pulled me into a corner to talk about a project pitch she wanted my help with, and Oase had drifted away to talk to a group near the bar. And in that space, with the warm night air and the lights and the wine, I started to feel something I hadn't expected. I missed Kieran. Not in a sad way, in a sharp, clarifying way. I missed his specific laugh, the quiet one he does when something genuinely catches him off guard. I missed the way he would have stood beside me at this party, uncomfortable but trying, because he loved me. And I realized, standing there on that rooftop, that the frustration I'd been carrying had metastasized into something unfair. I hadn't told him how lonely I'd been feeling. I'd just decided to punish him for a problem I'd never named out loud. I found Oase and told him I wanted to go. He read my face. He's always been perceptive, and nodded without asking questions. We said our goodbyes, thanked Tamsin, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. In the car, Oase said, "You okay?" "I think I handled something wrong," I said. He didn't say anything for a second. Then, "With Kieran?" "Yeah." He nodded slowly. I figured this wasn't really about the party. I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that you've seemed off for a while, and that Kieran has seemed off too, and that neither of you seems to be talking about it." He paused. "He mentioned something to me a few weeks ago. Nothing specific. Just that he felt like you were somewhere else lately." That landed hard. Kieran had gone to Oase before he'd come to me, and instead of hearing that as a sign that my husband was struggling and reaching out, I had responded by keeping secrets and making pointed choices. We drove home mostly in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was the kind of silence that follows a thing you needed to hear. We pulled into my driveway at about 11:30. The house was lit, living room light on, the bluish flicker of the television visible through the front window. Kieran was still up. Oase cut the engine, and we sat there for a moment. "Come in," I said. "I think we should all talk." Oase hesitated. "That's between you and him, Priya." "You're part of it," I said. "The fact that he talked to you before he talked to me. I need us all to be in the same room. Otherwise, I'm going to walk in there and have half a conversation." He thought about it. Then he nodded. We went inside. Kieran was on the couch with a book open in his lap, though the television was also on, which told me he hadn't been reading so much as existing in the room, waiting. He looked up when I came in, and then he looked past me at Oase, and something moved across his face. Not quite what I'd expected. Not anger, something more complicated, a kind of recognition. "Hey," Oase said from the doorway. "Hey," Kieran said. I sat down in the armchair across from the couch. Oase stayed near the door, and then the 3 of us sat in the particular silence of people who all know something important is about to be said. I was the one who spoke first. "I should have told you Oase was coming with me tonight." Kieran nodded once, slowly. "Yeah." I was frustrated. Not about tonight specifically. I stopped, tried to find the right place to start. "I've been feeling lonely. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because I haven't told you that I need more from you when it comes to showing up together. And instead of telling you, I just started resenting you quietly." Kieran put the book down. He was looking at me steadily. "I know," he said. "I've felt it." "He told me," I said, nodding toward Oase, "that you mentioned something to him." Kieran glanced at Oase, and there was no betrayal in the look, just a kind of tired acknowledgement. "I didn't know how to bring it up," he said. "You've seemed busy, and when you're busy, you get—" he paused, careful with his words. You build momentum, and it feels hard to interrupt. You should interrupt me, I said. Kieran, you should always interrupt me for this. He looked down at his hands. I know. I've been bad at that. Owe shifted near the doorway. I'll give you guys some space. Wait, Kieran said. And then he said something that none of us expected. There's something in the kitchen, he said. Something I found tonight while you were out. I felt my stomach drop in the formless, pre-specific way it does when you don't yet know what the bad thing is, but you can feel its shape. Kieran stood up and walked to the kitchen. Awais and I followed. On the kitchen counter, next to the fruit bowl, was a plain white envelope. It had been opened. The flap was torn unevenly, the way Kieran opens mail, impatiently. Kieran picked it up and held it out to me. It came today, he said. I almost didn't open it. It's addressed to you, but the return address was the hospital, so I thought it might be a billing thing, and I opened it without looking carefully. I took the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet. A letter from a cardiologist's office. The practice attached to the hospital where I'd gone 6 weeks earlier for what I'd told Kieran was a routine checkup. It was not routine. I had been experiencing occasional palpitations, a shortness of breath during exercise that hadn't been there 2 years ago, a fatigue I'd attributed to work stress. I'd gone to our regular doctor, who'd referred me to a specialist. I'd had an echocardiogram and a stress test and some blood work, and I had been waiting for the results, which had apparently arrived today, in this envelope, which my husband had now read. I looked at the letter. The news was not terrible, but it was not nothing. There was a finding, a structural irregularity, a mild mitral valve issue that would require monitoring and possibly, depending on how it progressed, eventual intervention. The cardiologist's letter was asking me to schedule a follow-up. I had known about this possibility for 6 weeks. I had not told Kieran. I had not told him because I was scared, and because I had made the calculation, the wrong one, that I would wait until I knew something definitive before I worried him. But 6 weeks had passed, and I hadn't made the follow-up appointment, and I had been carrying this entirely alone, while also quietly resenting my husband for emotional distance I had actively created. I looked up from the letter. Kieran was watching me. You went to a cardiologist, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a sentence shaped like grief. I was going to tell you, I said, and then I stopped because it sounded hollow and I knew it. When? He asked. I didn't have an answer. Oais had taken a step back. I was peripherally aware of him trying to give us space within the small room. Kieran wasn't looking at him. He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger, not even hurt exactly, but a kind of sorrow, mixed with something that looked almost like fear. Priya, he said, I've been here. I have been right here. I know, I said. Whatever is going on with you, your health, your loneliness, all of it, I need you to let me be here for it. That's what I'm supposed to be. His voice broke slightly on the last word, and he caught it, pressed his lips together. You can't shut me out and then be hurt that there's a distance between us. You're building the distance. The truth of it hit me cleanly and completely. I had been so focused on the story of my loneliness, the party, the pattern, the accumulation of solo arrivals, that I had missed the fact that I had been the architect of my own isolation in the most critical ways. I hadn't told him I was lonely. I hadn't told him I was scared. I had kept the thing that mattered most locked inside and then resented the gap it created. I sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. The letter was still in my hand. I was scared, I said finally. I didn't want to make it real, and I told myself I'd tell you once I had more information, but I think what I really wanted was to handle it myself and then present you with a resolved situation, so you wouldn't worry. That's not, Kieran started, then stopped, took a breath. That's not your job. to manage my emotions about your health. That's not how this works." "I know," I said. "I know." Owais said, very quietly from the edge of the room, "I'm going to go." Neither of us stopped him this time. He caught my eye briefly as he moved toward the hallway, and the look he gave me was not judgment. It was something more like solidarity, and also a gentle nudging. "Talk to your husband," the look said. "Actually talk to him." I heard the front door close behind him. Kieran and I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I made tea, mostly because I needed something to do with my hands. We talked the way we hadn't talked in months, the way we used to talk in the first years of our marriage, with all the protective layers peeled back. I told him about the appointment. All of it. The palpitations, the referral, the echocardiogram, sitting alone in the waiting room, the drive home where I'd cried in the parking garage for 20 minutes before pulling myself together enough to face traffic. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. "I would have come with you," he said. "I know," I said. "I didn't let you." He was quiet for a moment. "This thing, the valve, how serious is it?" "Mild," I said. "Monitoring stage. They want to see me every year, maybe adjust some things. The letter says most people with this live completely normally, but it's there, and I need to follow up." He nodded. "We'll go together. To the follow-up." "Okay," I said. Then he said, "And the other thing? The loneliness. I want to understand that too. Not just accept it. I want to actually understand what you need from me." So I told him that too. About how the accumulated pattern of going places alone had started to feel like evidence of something, even if it wasn't. About how I needed him to stretch sometimes, not to become someone he wasn't, but to show up even when it was uncomfortable, because showing up in discomfort was how I knew I mattered to him. And he told me, with the kind of honesty that only comes late at night in quiet kitchens, that he had felt me pulling away and hadn't known how to name it, so he'd retreated further, and that the distance between us had grown the way these things always grow, incrementally, with both people contributing, and neither one quite able to see it until it became undeniable. We talked until almost 2 a.m. The next day, Kieran called Owais. I don't know exactly what was said, that was their conversation, but afterward, Kieran told me that Owais had apologized for not telling him about the invitation sooner. Owais, it turned out, had felt caught between us for a while, aware that something was wrong, unsure whose confidence he was keeping, unsure how to be a good friend to both of us simultaneously. Kieran told him that he didn't blame him, and that he was glad Owais had been there that night actually. "You got her home," he told him, "and you made her think." The three of us had dinner together about 2 weeks later, a normal, easy dinner, the kind we'd had dozens of times before, and it wasn't strange. Owais ribbed me gently about the whole thing once, and I accepted it, and Kieran laughed, and that was the end of it as a source of tension between any of us. I went back to the cardiologist in September. Kieran came with me. We sat in the waiting room together, and he held my hand, and we talked about inconsequential things to fill the time, a documentary we'd been watching, what we wanted to do for the upcoming long weekend, and it was the most connected I had felt in our marriage in probably 2 years. The follow-up was reassuring. The cardiologist confirmed it was mild, said my general fitness was actually a protective factor, gave me a monitoring schedule and some lifestyle guidance, and sent us on our way. In the elevator down to the parking garage, Kieran exhaled slowly, and I saw the tension leave his shoulders. "Okay," he said. "Yeah," I said. He put his arm around me, and we walked to the car. I've thought a lot about what I learned that summer, and I think it comes down to something disarmingly simple. The loneliness we feel inside relationships is almost never caused by the other person's absence. It's caused by our own silence. We stop naming what we need. We start managing people's perceptions of us instead of trusting them with the truth. We protect everyone from our fear and then wonder why we feel alone with it. I kept my health scare from my husband because I didn't want to be a burden. I kept my loneliness from him because I didn't want to seem needy. I kept my frustration from him until it had fermented into resentment, and then I expressed it sideways, through small punishments, through omissions, through the kind of low-level passive behavior that poisons things quietly over time. And none of it was because Kieran had failed me. He had simply been allowed to. The party, the invitation to Oasis, the drive home. None of that was the story. The envelope on the kitchen counter was the story. What was inside it was the story. And what I had done with that information for 6 weeks, carrying it alone, in silence, building walls out of the very fear that was asking me to let someone in, that was the real thing I had to reckon with. There's a version of that night where I walk in through the front door, Oasis drives away, and I tell Kieran a cheerful half-truth about the party. In that version, the envelope sits on the counter, and I pick it up casually and say something like, "Oh, this is nothing, just a follow-up," and tuck it away. In that version, nothing gets resolved. The distance keeps growing. The silence keeps accumulating. I'm grateful every day that the night didn't go that way. Kieran and I started doing something small but deliberate after that, a standing Sunday evening check-in. Nothing formal, just 20 or 30 minutes, phones away, talking about how we're actually doing. Not logistics, not schedules, not the week ahead. How we're doing, what we're carrying, what we need. It sounds almost embarrassingly simple, and I think that's exactly the point. The things that save a marriage are rarely dramatic. They're mostly just the consistent, unglamorous choice to show up and tell the truth. We've had some uncomfortable Sundays. We've also had some that left me feeling like I married exactly the right person. Oasis came to our place for Kieran's birthday last November, and at some point during the evening, after dinner, over drinks on the back porch, he looked at the two of us and said, "You seem different." Not better in a pointed way, just different. We were. We are. That's the story. It's not glamorous, and the ending isn't a revelation so much as a beginning of the kind of honesty that I wish I'd been practicing all along. But I think that's how most real turning points work. They don't arrive as dramatic moments. They arrive as envelopes on kitchen counters, or late-night conversations over tea, or the quiet clarifying drive home from a party where you realize that the person you're most frustrated with is yourself. I hope, if you're in the middle of something like this, that you'll skip the part where you carry it alone. Find your person. Open the envelope together. It's almost always less terrible than you imagined. And whatever it is, you were never supposed to face it by yourself.